Right, what's up guys, JJ Richards here, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So before we get into today's podcast, please make sure you give the video a big thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Now, I'm very excited about today's video because it is with Dr. Dean St Mart. He's a very knowledgeable individual and I'm very honoured to have him on today. So please make sure, stay tuned, give it a watch, and I hope you guys enjoy. Right then, what's up everybody? Welcome to today's video. So I'm super excited about this video and I know it's going to be very educational because I've been watching Dr. Dean St Mart for quite a few years now, and he's like my go-to person now whenever I'm kind of looking for any information, anything educational when it comes to performance enhancing drugs. And we actually have been chatting quite a lot over the year because we've been in a lot of the same places at the same time. So I pick his brain as much as possible. So to actually get him on my channel today, I'm very honored. So thank you very much, Dean. I really appreciate your time, mate.
Appreciate you asking me on, JJ. I'm looking forward to what we're going to talk about today. Like you've probably seen, we had that seminar a couple of weeks ago that you attended where we were over in Dean White's gym, Falcon Fitness. So it's nice that we can get here to, I guess, expand on some of the stuff that we touched on in the seminar, but more in a personal context for you now.
Absolutely. So just a little bit of a disclaimer and I'll explain what we're going to be actually talking through today. So I actually got my blood work done 2 weeks ago at the seminar that Dean was just talking about. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to be really transparent with my own personal blood work, what I'm using, etc. So we're going to go through it with you. Obviously, Dean's going to give his opinion on my blood work, and then obviously, hopefully you guys can look at it and obviously you can learn something from it yourself. But this is solely hypothetical. This is just personal to me, and this is not medical advice. So do not take anything that we say as medical advice and start doing different stuff. Okay. So I've got to put the disclaimer in there. So what we'll do is we'll just quickly introduce ourselves, a little bit of background, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my blood work with you, and obviously we're going to go through it with you all. And we're going to just we're not going to go through every single line because we'll be here for hours and hours, but we're just going to go through what is relevant to me. And obviously, I'm always open for learning new things as well. And blood work is something at the moment, it's a topic that I'm really trying to increase my education on. So as well as me being here, on the podcast today, I'm going to be learning a lot myself as well, because every time I have a chat with Dean, like my brain is always like cogs are spinning because I'm always learning lots of things. There's always lots of information to take on board as well. So hence why I have a notepad and pen, because I'm one of these people that when I listen to something, I normally have to listen to things a few times for it to actually sink into my skull. Academically, that's how I learn best. So I'll probably go through this podcast and listen to it a few more times, but I also make notes because that's just a way for me to learn best. For whatever reason, I'm not very good at information going in here and into there, but everyone learns differently, don't they?
Exactly. Yeah.
Perfect.
Exactly.
So just want to introduce yourself first, Dean, to everybody.
Yeah, so as you said, I'm Dr. Dean St Mart. I'm the formulator for a UK-based supplement company called Supplement Needs. I probably came to be very nice. I've probably become known in terms of the bodybuilding community or health and fitness community when I started to apply an area of medicine known as functional medicine towards bodybuilding. My background is in pharmacology and the design of drugs. So basically from, I guess, my early 20s, I started to understand and how we apply, I guess, proper, correct pharmacology science to bodybuilding and the use of supplements and performance enhancing drugs. I guess my sort of notoriety was sort of to cut straight through bro science that's pretty much been spouted on forums for decades and trying to get guys to understand the logical science of how we might approach and use these compounds. Because at the end of the day, the stigma that's attached to the sport of bodybuilding and the use of these compounds all stems from a lack of education and, I guess, a misunderstanding within the general population on potentially how we may use these compounds in a safe manner. Like I've said countless times, and a lot of people have sort of taken the same sentence that I've used. These were originally designed as medicines. So we've just been a little more savvy in terms of how we can utilize them for performance enhancement and recovery. There's nothing sinister to speak about these compounds. It's just that if we understand the underlying mechanism of how they may contribute to disease, we can put strategies in place to offset.
Exactly. And I think the way the fitness and bodybuilding community is moving now is in the right direction, because, you know, I actually did my first competition in 2009. So I've actually been using performance enhancing drugs since 2009, and that's about 12 years ago now. So, but back then when I first started, it was a taboo subject that not one person ever spoke about. And I partly understand the reason, you know, the reason being for that is because a lot of these athletes, their only source of income was these supplement companies that wanted them to think that actually you drink, you know, muscle tech to get the muscles that you do. It's not anything to do with performance enhancing drugs. But now obviously all the pro athletes have got their own kind of platforms now to generate their own income. Now people are talking about it a lot more, because even, you know, we used to go to, you know, the body power from the first of the year, and still, you know, there's a little bit more now when we're actually at these expos where people are talking about it. And I think it kind of started really, I think, from when Dallas McCarver and Rich Piana both kind of passed. And I think that was kind of then the movement into like now health supplements. I know like Supplement Needs are obviously leaders when it comes to health supplements. And there's quite a few other companies as well that are jumping on board with it. But when I first started in 2009, it was literally take a milk thistle tablet every day and you're fine. Yeah. And that was the only thing that people knew. People didn't even know what milk thistle did, why they did it, but it was just like, you know, you'd know if, you know, as soon as someone was in the health food shop buying some milk thistle, you knew exactly what it was, you know, what they were doing. But that was the only real information out there. So now that actually, you know, it's come to light a lot more and people are open to talk about it. And, you know, it's one benefit of social media is that people can put their own content out there. And it is well spoken about now, which I think is a positive.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like we've seen in the last, like you said, since Dallas McCarver, Rich Piana, and then even this year with quite a lot of high-tiered bodybuilding athletes, Sean Roden, etc., who passed away. I think what we've sort of now started to see is this open discussion, more so from a harm reduction perspective. That was always where my point of view came from, was I'd rather someone know how to potentially mitigate these side effects than drop dead in their 40s. And that's unfortunately what we're starting to see, is a lot of the misinformation from the like mid 2000s to the early 2010s. Those guys are dropping dead now because of the choices they made back then weren't as educated as we can deliver today, basically.
Yeah.
And it really is unfortunate. But at the end of the day, what sort of made me speak out was my wife, obviously, my wife, Morgan, said to me, you know too much to be sort of sitting around and not being on social media and trying to educate people to stay healthy. And that was sort of what pushed me into then, where I first really got exposure to was being the educator on Jordan Peter's website.
Yeah.
And I'm really like showing guys there just very blunt science of what you're doing is wrong. And this is why you're doing it wrong. Do it this correct way, potentially, along with these other strategies. And, what we started to see was people's blood work and that forum being openly discussed, all of a sudden changing, and this light bulb moment of all these people saying, you know what we've been doing for years has been completely wrong. This is sort of the way forward on how I can stay healthy and potentially increase my longevity.
Yeah, exactly. And you compete in bodybuilding yourself as well, don't you? So you kind of on both sides of the scale. So
that's what sort of, what pushed me down this road of obviously this discussion was my own bodybuilding journey, and trying to, but even when I was doing my own research in my early 20s, like from my background knowledge from my undergraduate degree and my own formal education, it just didn't make sense what I was reading about. And eventually it came to a point where you just thought, why are people doing it this way when really the correct way would be this? And, supplementation wise, what are the sort of the key supplements that I might be able to take for, say, cardiovascular health, my liver, my kidneys, to offset some of the potential damage that's happening?
Yeah.
How these molecules interact in the body. And by applying that personally to myself, I was able to then, share that information. And obviously that's where the whole idea of the CV or heart stack for supplement needs came from. The liver stack, Astrag flow is the kidney and blood pressure. They're all designed because, you know, even from my own personal perspective, you're buying like 20 different supplements and you're opening like a pot of, you know, each one and taking a tablet out. It was just time consuming. And there was just a huge gap there that, you know, why isn't someone just made a supplement range for the health of bodybuilders?
Yeah.
And general population? You know, those 3 supplements do extend into the general population as well. But why isn't someone created a range that caters specifically for this health issue that may arise? And again, that longevity and risk mitigation.
Do you think that was just solely the lack of knowledge and education within the industry why somebody didn't do it, or just because people didn't care?
I think a bit of both. And to be honest, when we started doing the formulas that we do at Supplement Needs, myself and Lee, you know, we haven't seen many people follow suit with us because of we're not willing to underdose or use proprietary blends where everything is sort of masked under one sort of matrix. Yeah. Everything is fully disclosed. You know, I've made a key point to educate people on each ingredient in the product, why the products are formulated with a specific purpose. And, you know, yes, you've said that there's people have sort of hopped on board, but there's still yet to be rival companies in my mind that are doing probably the same job as we are, where we're not sort of cutting corners at the expense of consumers. And at the end of the day, if you're going to cut corners at the expense of consumers to save money, you're really cutting corners at the expense of the customer's health.
Yeah.
And that's a big ethic reason that I'm not willing to make with Supplement Needs, and neither is Lee, that we want to have fully disclosed, fully dosed stacks effectively that, you know, encompass all the different root causes that contribute to disease if you're going to use these compounds.
Yeah, perfect. Good. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to pull up my blood work. So obviously everyone can see it. So I'm going to be very transparent with everyone so they can see exactly what my blood work is. And just to kind of frame it, so I've kind of always, well, I've probably said over the last kind of 5 or 6 years, had my blood work done consistently every year. However, that was done through a corporate company that I used to work for, but I just kind of get the blood work done. It's from like, you know, a general doctor, and they couldn't kind of give the answers based on somebody that takes performance enhancing drugs. And also I didn't tell them as well, because, you know, it wasn't the right environment to do it. So this for me is going to be obviously educational for me as well as everybody else, but this blood work was done, and it's the only time I've ever done blood work where I've actually been on cycle. I know from your seminar that we went to a couple of weeks ago, we spoke about kind of trying to get it done obviously at the worst case scenario, and obviously you've got then something to kind of you've got some numbers then to go against, obviously, you know, when you come off cycle or when you're on TRT or afterwards. So you can kind of see, you know, the detrimental effects that your blood work has when obviously you're on performance enhancers, and obviously when you come off, then obviously if you've tried to get those numbers back, and also to give you an understanding of actually what health supplements you need to take, because sometimes you might not need to use it if you haven't got any issues in that. So it's good to try and always get them done year round. And that's something now that I'm going to do. You know, it's a personal investment. I would say that people will happily go and spend 100, 200 pounds on some steroids, but they're not willing to spend that money on the blood work. So, you know, and that's something now for me that I want to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share it with you now. So this should work. Hopefully we've just done a practice run. So can you see that now?
Yeah, perfect.
Good. So just a shout out. So top right corner there, you can see Transform Now was obviously the company that I did, and they do quite a bit of work with Supplement Needs, don't they? When you're at the expos, in Man's quite frequently.
Yeah, I mean, Transform Now is run by Dr. Imran Khan, and as a funny artifact, I'm actually the clinical director of the Irish branch of Transform Now that is about to start up and running. That will have a private online blood work service for North and South of Ireland. So Dr. Imran is a very good friend of mine. So he's on the same sort of mission as me to try and, you know, invest as much time as possible into keeping both amateur and professional athletes healthy. Yeah, he shares a lot of the same ethics as myself when it comes to education and people's choice of using these compounds.
And just a question before we go into it. So obviously, when you get blood work done, there's a couple of different ways you can do it. One is obviously where they'll draw blood straight from the vein, and then you've got like the home check ones where it's like a finger prick. And I've heard from people before that have had the finger prick done one, and some things have been elevated and have been quite worried, and then they've gone and got the ones from the veins, and the results have been quite different, and it's only been a short space of time. Can that have an effect, whether it comes from the finger or the vein?
Yes, it can. I mean, ideally, you want to have a venesection sample that's coming from the actual vein. The finger prick sort of stemmed from being able to do like a micro analysis on, a couple of milliliters of blood. But the problem there is when you lancet your finger to draw that blood, the surface damage that's done to the epidermis to get that blood out through the skin of your finger, it can damage the red blood cells, obviously, because you're piercing a needle through.
Yeah.
So if you're not diligent in your sample collection, where the first, say, 3 or 4 drops of blood coming out of your finger, that you don't use those drops of blood as your sample, what you potentially might see is your full blood count, the red blood cells might be damaged and the white blood cells might be damaged, because obviously the needle is pierced through and burst these cells as it's going through.
Okay.
So you'll see a change in the blood count, and that might not give you an accurate representation of, say, the hematocrit or the hemoglobin. The sort of hormone side of things, or the small molecule analysis, like the proteins, your kidney function, your liver function, you'll probably be able to draw I'd say maybe a 95% accurate conclusion from a small sample of blood. Okay. Provided again that none of the contents of those proteins, etc., were damaged. Okay. Again, same principle with the needle piercing your skin. So it's always best if you can draw a sample from your vein. Good,
perfect. So obviously, as we can see, we've got my blood work on the screen now. So I'm happy for kind of Dean to go through it all, and obviously we're not going to go through every single thing and what it means and what it does, but we can kind of like the main ones, and kind of in your opinion as well, when people are getting blood work done, what are the kind of key things that they should really be aware of? And obviously, for example, as you can see, some of mine are in the red, and that is going to come when you're using performance enhancing drugs, especially when you're on cycle. So, and then obviously just your opinion on supplements that I could take to help with that, etc.
Yeah, so I guess to break it down simply before we start, you have the top, which is your full blood count, which looks at your red and white blood cells and your platelets. You have your biochemistry panel that looks at mainly your liver as well as your iron metabolism. You then obviously have your kidney function, your liver function, your lipids, which is probably on the next page, for your cholesterol, your hormones, your male hormones and female sex hormone estradiol, and then your thyroid function, along with your prostate and some other biochemistry markers such as vitamin D and serum folate, which again just show instances what's happening with metabolism in the body. So like to start your full blood count, you have your hemoglobin, which is the I guess the molecules that carry iron in your body. You have your total red blood cells. You have your hematocrit, which is the percentage of red blood cells in your unit volume of blood. You have your mean cell volume, which is basically the average size of your red blood cells. You have your red cell distribution width, which is the variation in the size. You have the mean cell hemoglobin, which is the amount of that hemoglobin in one red blood cell. Okay. And then you have the MCHC, which is the mean cell hemoglobin concentration, which is the amount of hemoglobin in a group of cells. You'd have your platelets and the mean platelet volume, which is the size of your platelets. And then you have your white blood cells, and they're broken down into neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, basophils, and then just a film report of how those cells look on a slide under a microscope. Okay. So main things here that happen when you use anabolic steroids. Anabolic steroids exert their effect by binding to the androgen receptors inside your cells. So inside the cytoplasm of your cell, you have these androgen receptors being expressed. You take a compound like testosterone or any sort of synthetic steroid like equipoise or baldanone or nandrolone. That molecule passes across the cell membrane inside your cell and binds to the androgen receptor. When it binds to that, that complex goes to the nucleus where all your DNA is inside your cell and tells it to express certain genes or certain proteins as a consequence of how it docks into the different sections of gene transcription in your nucleus of your cell. So when that happens, one of the things that can, I guess, affect your full blood count when you use anabolic steroids is your hemoglobin may slightly increase. So your iron retention in the body slightly increases. And we can see in the biochemistry panel, you have your iron, your ferritin, which is the storage form of iron, your transferrin saturation, which effectively is a protein which transports iron in the body, and how saturated that protein is with iron molecules. And then you have your total iron blood concentration, which is TIBC. And effectively that is all the iron within your body between iron, ferritin, and transferrin as a collective number. So we can see in the blood work here, your hemoglobin is slightly elevated, meaning that you have a higher percentage of the iron transporting, oxygen transporting molecule in your blood. So effectively, you'd have higher performance in terms of oxygen carrying capacity. So you potentially have greater endurance on your training. Your red blood cells have managed to stay normal. So you're not exhibiting what we call erythropoiesis, where you're making too many red blood cells or too many white blood cells, would be the other artifact of it. And your hematocrit is slightly elevated at 55.7% or 0.557. So effectively, that is telling us that you have 55% of your blood content is red blood cells. Now, ideally, the way your blood sort of is broken down, you've got sort of 50% red blood cells. You've got about 50% plasma, and then within that sort of 50% of your red blood cells are your plasma and your white blood cells as well. So sort of a 50-50 ratio. And that's sort of where, if you look, the hematocrit goes anywhere from 38% to 50% as the reference range. Effectively, again, ideally, the correct sort of composition of blood should be 55% plasma and 45% red blood cells. So your plasma is very important because, again, it's like a transport medium. It carries all your proteins. It helps your body to maintain homeostasis. So that's what helps to keep your body at correct temperature, etc. So it's an important aspect. And we don't measure plasma when we're doing blood work. We derive how much plasma is present based on the hematocrit number. So as you can see, you've got a higher percentage of red blood cells than plasma at the moment.
So with my hemoglobin obviously being elevated, which obviously we know comes with taking anabolic steroids. So if I was to run them for a long period of time and that was to stay high for a long period of time, what potential like health impacts may that have or side effects?
I don't think you'd see anything directly correlated to hemoglobin itself being elevated. What you would see something causing damage would be if your iron was elevated long term. So free iron within your blood would be more detrimental than actually iron inside your red blood cells. So the higher the amount of hemoglobin inside your red blood cells, effectively the more oxygen you can carry, because oxygen forms a complex with heme in your red blood cells to carry it through the body. And again, the reverse of it is it also helps to recycle carbon dioxide, which is carried then in the plasma. So with the hematocrit being at 55, nearly 56, it is stating that your blood is a little more viscous than it should be. meaning that potentially you might be at higher risk for a thrombotic event. Now, we need to take that into context towards where your platelets are when you're within your blood. So the platelets are the molecules in our blood that effectively help to clot when we have an injury within the artery or within the body. If you have a scenario where you have a high percentage of hematocrit and you have a high number of platelets, effectively you've got all these red blood cells sort of clumped together trying to force its way through your blood.
Yeah.
And say, for example, any sort of arterial event happened where you had like a micro trauma inside the artery, you're going to have an overreactive response because you have a lot more platelets present.
Okay.
Obviously, platelets form blood clots, and that's ultimately what would travel to your heart or your brain to trigger a stroke, aneurysm, or heart attack. Now, how we have to view hematocrit also is that you could be potentially dehydrated. So hematocrit, when it's elevated, just means that there's a higher percentage of red blood cells in that blood volume that's been drawn. That could be just because there's not enough hydration in the body. So there's not enough water, or, the plasma itself is aqueous. So you might be slightly dehydrated, given a falsely elevated hematocrit.
Okay.
Now, the fact that this was in the evening time, we have to take into context that you probably were hydrated. So what would be the best case scenario here would be we'd have to make a decision. Is it worth staying at that hematocrit, that higher percentage of red blood cells in your blood, even though your red blood cell count is normal? Eventually, what potentially might happen is, because of how anabolic steroids stimulate EPO from your kidney. So EPO is the erythropoietin hormone, which stimulates your spleen to produce more red blood cells. So it causes, again, the proliferation of more red blood cells, and then white blood cells are an artifact of that also.
Yeah, that's what the cyclists use, isn't it? EPO a lot.
Yeah, and one of the compounds that you mentioned to me, equipoise, does have a propensity to increase erythropoiesis due to how it interacts at the kidneys androgen receptors to upregulate EPO production. So it could be, again, an artifact of the compounds that you're using. Right now, in terms of the reds, your hemoglobin being red, your hematocrit being red. The mean cell volume, like I said, is the average size of your red blood cells. So your mean cell volume is just saying that your red blood cell is just slightly bigger than the reference range.
Okay.
But that's more than likely because of the hemoglobin. But if we look at the mean cell hemoglobin, which is the amount of hemoglobin in one single cell, that's sitting at 32.4. So whilst your hemoglobin, in terms of the concentration of it in your blood, is elevated, the actual amount that's inside your red blood cells is normal.
Okay.
And we see that between the mean cell hemoglobin and the MCHC would be how much hemoglobin is in a collection of cells. Yeah. So whilst you have some reds there, there's nothing, hugely to, I guess, jump on for now. It's a complete artifact of the androgen receptor stimulating higher concentrations of heme in your blood. And hematocrit, again, is just a consequence of more heme, more red blood cells being present. A venesection of donating blood, removing blood, is probably one of the only methods that you're going to have in order to lower hematocrit.
Okay.
You can effectively use supplements like ionositol phosphate hexaphosphate, which is IP6. So IP6 as a supplement chelates iron from your blood. But if you look at your blood iron content, your ferritin in the storage form and transferrin, all that's normal. So there's no point in us chelating iron out of your blood, because it's not really contributing directly to the hemoglobin being elevated.
So if iron in the blood is high, what risk factors could that bring? So
iron is an oxidant in your blood. So effectively, iron seeks out electrons within your blood when it's being passed through your body. So as an oxidant, it will cause oxidation. So it itself will reduce something, meaning that it's going to gain electrons.
Okay.
So effectively what that means is it's going to look for cells where it can steal electrons from. Now, if you steal electrons from a cell, you make that cell very unstable.
Okay.
And that's where we have antioxidants, where they replenish cells with their electrons in order to restabilize that cell again.
Okay.
So when you have a higher amount of iron in your body, you're going to cause oxidation in your arteries. And that oxidation could be oxidizing your cholesterol, which you definitely don't want to happen, because it makes your cholesterol an unstable particle, which contributes to plaque. It can damage the vasculature cells, so it can damage the endothelial cells around your arteries. So your arteries are covered by a single cell layer of epithelial cells, which protect then obviously the smooth muscle which your artery is created from. So those epithelial cells can get damaged, and effectively, you know, because it's only one cell thick, it will allow molecules to pass easily into the extracellular space of your artery, which again, it can then cause damage within the actual artery itself.
Perfect.
So in terms of that, you know, everything there is normal. The marker that's sort of along with the iron ferritin transfer and TIBC is CRP. So CRP is C-reactive protein. That's a marker of total body inflammation. Your body effectively makes C-reactive protein in the liver in response to elevated cytokines in the body.
Okay.
So when there's inflammatory molecules elevated in the body, your liver produces CRP as sort of like the master defense molecule to kill off pathogens. But sometimes that elevation and inflammation, those inflammatory markers, are elevated because of there's actually an injury within the body itself. And the CRP elevation then is a consequence of that elevation. So ideally CRP, the reference range there is less than 5. Yours is at 1.14. Ideally, we want CRP to be less than 1.
Okay.
And really, ideally, we want it to be about less than 0.5. We don't want an increase in CRP in the body unless there's a specific purpose. So if you had a cold recently or a flu, you might see a small elevation in CRP still being carried over.
Okay.
And that effectively is just showing that your body has had its own defense system at play. So if you get blood work done in the middle of having a flu or a cold, your CRP could be in the teens. So you might see it at 14, 15, because your body's making tons of this molecule to kill off a virus or a bacteria that's present causing infection. But when there's none of those symptoms present, or there's no history of that happening recently, it's saying that your body's making this inflammatory molecule in response to a level of inflammation in the body.
Okay.
Again, that could be training induced, which again would artificially increase CRP, not massively, but enough to trigger it to be maybe close to 1. Or effectively, it could be that, you know, there is some mild arterial disease starting to develop in the body that your body's trying to combat.
Okay.
So sort of the main supplements to sort of offset, you know, elevations in CRP would be potentially curcuminoids, which are the active constituents of curcumin and turmeric. Stuff like Boswellia serrata, which again has 5-LOX inhibitor molecules within it, which lowers inflammation in the body. And then some antioxidants like resveratrol, green tea extract, which help to provide electrons to stabilize molecules within the body. So they'd be sort of considerations there with the CRP being not massively elevated, just mildly elevated.
Perfect.
I guess a sort of an aside I should have said from the beginning, the normal ranges that are present, that is the average range of the population. So it does not mean that if you're inside or outside that normal range that you're not normal, effectively.
Okay, yeah.
Every person who uses a specific laboratory. So you would have used a specific laboratory if you look down below Eurofins County Pathology. So everyone who uses Eurofins, every year they go back and they collate all the results.
Okay.
And effectively they draw up the 95th percentile of all the samples, basically. So they exclude the bottom 5% and they exclude the top 5%. And that sort of leaves you then with a 90% range of, you know, who's healthy versus who's not in their mind. Effectively,
do they do blood work for everybody?
They'd be just one lab. You know, there are several other labs within the country, especially, you know, hospitals would have their own labs where they'd have their own reference range.
Okay.
Like the NHS would have its own reference range. But effectively, it means that if you have a very sick population, the reference range may increase because everyone is sick, so they have elevated numbers. And if you have a population who's very healthy, the reference range might be lower.
Okay.
So, you know, it's very difficult. What we try and derive from these reference ranges is what's the optimal value.
Yeah.
And we know the optimal value for CRP for very low inflammation in the body would be to have it as close to 0 as possible. But definitely, you know, if you're at 5 for CRP, you're definitely not healthy, in my opinion.
Okay.
You have an elevation in inflammation in the body that's chronic. So it needs to be addressed. And that's why it becomes a very important marker for cardiovascular health in bodybuilders, because as years progress and you see your CRP elevate, if it's not in response to infection, you know that there is arterial damage happening.
So would you say in that kind of section at the bottom that the CRP is one that people really need to focus on?
It would be one that in the context of your lipid panel for cardiovascular health, without going down a very advanced cardiovascular diagnostic test, CRP is a very easy way to assess current arterial inflammation and the risk that it brings.
Perfect. So then obviously moving down into, we've got kidney and liver function. So just at a very basic level, just if people don't know, so what is the primary function of the kidney?
So your kidneys have special, I guess, a bunch of cells within the kidneys known as the glomulars. So the glomulars effectively have a high network of capillaries. So you can effectively think of it as a net, a system of different nets. And those nets catch molecules that don't effectively pass through the nets properly. So its primary function is to filter the blood of large molecules and, I guess, retain sodium and potassium back into the blood. So it provides homeostasis towards electrolyte balance and obviously the fluid volume of your blood. Okay. It also then has an important function of excretion. So again, those molecules that it's able to filter out, if they're water soluble, they pass into the urine and they're collected, and then obviously your bladder and you treat them out. So with the kidneys, what we're looking at here is the main sort of markers that are looked at for bodybuilders are sodium, which again is just an electrolyte of the blood. So when you ingest salt, sodium is the active element alongside chloride. You have your urea, which is a marker of potentially nitrogen balance within the body and how much nitrogen is present. So urea would be a byproduct of nitrogen metabolism. So obviously when you eat a lot of protein, protein's main constituent is nitrogen, and that's what we need for building muscle protein. Are amino acids, and amino acids, you know, the name amino is derived from nitrogen. And then we have creatinine, which is a small molecule byproduct of creatine metabolism. So when creatine gets metabolized, it's effectively broken down into creatinine. Okay. Creatinine is important because we can effectively measure the rate at which it's removed from the blood. And that can give us then an indication of how efficient your glomulars are. So we have this EGFR, which is your estimated glomerular filtration rate. In blood work panels, the EGFR, we have quite a number of different, I guess, calculations that we can use. So as you see in this one, it's using the MDRD equation. really what's probably more, I guess, applicable to bodybuilders is what's known as the Crockford-Galt equation.
Yeah.
And the Crockford-Galt equation is important because it takes into account body surface area when it's calculating your glomerular filtration rates. So for bodybuilders, it takes into account how much muscle mass is present in your body.
Okay.
The MDRD doesn't. So you just end up with a value that's directly correlated to your creatinine value. Okay. Now, creatinine will be falsely elevated, and I mean falsely elevated in terms of being in the red due to ingesting high amounts of protein. So again, as a consequence of that, you'll be ingesting creatine with red meat, and creatine breaks down into creatinine. You will see an elevation in creatinine if you're using creatine as a supplement itself, because you're elevating how much creatine is in your blood, and that has to be broken down into creatinine for excretion. And training will also artificially increase creatinine because of muscle protein breakdown. When you're breaking down muscle protein, you're releasing amino acids, and those amino acids can then correlate to creatinine also. Effectively, creatine is a peptide, so it's made up of amino acids. So you can effectively create creatine in your body from ingestion of amino acids. So that can artificially increase creatinine. So sitting at 123, you're outside that reference range, which is dropping your EGFR. Your urea is slightly elevated at 12.5. So in other words, you have a higher percentage of nitrogen in your blood. So effectively, there might be correlating back to the hematocrit. You might have been slightly dehydrated that day. So I know that evening time, I'm not sure, did you fast all day for this blood work or?
Not all day, no, about 3 hours.
So, you know, if you didn't fast all day, you might see a mild increase in urea because of the protein you ingested from your food. And obviously the hematocrit, if you weren't adequately hydrated before the test. So again, if you stopped drinking before the test, that might artificially increase the hematocrit and urea also.
So would the urea indicate that like the amount of protein I'm consuming is too high in my diet?
It can in certain individuals. It can show that you're not utilizing all that protein. So it's being pushed towards urea in that nitrogen cycle. And we can sort of look at your biochemistry that we skipped over a little bit. Your albumin and globulin are two proteins your body makes. So we monitor those to see how well your body utilizes amino acids also. And your total protein is then the sum of the albumin and globulin. So your albumin is sitting at 46.7 and your globulin's at 32.1. So ideally, we want those two to be sort of 1:1 or 2:1, ideally. So you want your albumin to be greater than your globulin, and that gives you an albumin-globulin ratio. And you can see your total protein sitting at 78.8 is towards the upper reference range. If you had kidney issues, we'd expect to see albumin actually fall because of your body's losing albumin, because the kidneys effectively can't retain albumin within the blood because the kidneys have become damaged. So they're allowing the albumin to pass into the urine.
Okay.
You know, where yours is sitting now is totally adequate. No signs of kidney damage. So that creatinine result is more likely elevated because of if you didn't rest for a minimum of 4 days prior to getting your bloods done, so at least 96 hours, you will see an elevation in creatinine because of the muscle protein breakdown effect.
And if you supplement with creatine as well, would you recommend before getting your bloods done to come off it or not?
I would. I'd always say, you know, if you're getting your bloods done, it's very difficult because we don't want to do it as bodybuilders, but a minimum of 96 hours rest, drop creatine use for about 10 to 14 days.
Okay.
And really lower your protein intake to about 1 gram per pound to support obviously that 1 gram per pound towards your muscle mass within your body. Your daily minimum nitrogen needs.
Yeah.
Now, when you do that, you're artificially skewing the result also when you think about it, because that's not like your normal typical daily diet.
Yeah.
Now, really why we're doing that is to remove that bias away from the creatinine. Now, if you've done all that, you rested, you lowered your creatine intake, you lowered your protein intake, and the creatinine is still elevated, then you'd be looking at potentially doing a blood test to look at either what's known as cystatin C, which is a larger molecule in your blood that is not affected by creatine or creatine breakdown or muscle protein breakdown. So that would give you an effective idea of how well your kidneys are filtering.
Okay.
And you could use something like, it's called asymmetric arginine, which is another small peptide we can monitor in the blood for how well the kidneys are filtering as well.
Okay.
So that's sort of the further diagnostic route that you'd go down. But I'd probably estimate, based on your body surface area, which would incorporate your height and your muscle mass, your eGFR is probably somewhere closer to 70 or 80. And
okay.
I can send you the link for the Crockford-Gelt equation.
Yeah.
But at 66, you're still above, where we don't want eGFR to fall below 60, because we're heading into the region of kidney disease or chronic kidney disease. Now, there's no probably escaping that most bodybuilders will develop some form of type 3 chronic kidney disease. It's just an artifact of increased blood pressure, increased protein intake, increased nitrogen retention. All that can contribute to a mild form of degeneration in the kidneys.
Okay.
The kidneys, unfortunately, unlike the liver, don't regenerate. So again, when those glomulars become stressed or a level of sclerosis, so scarring happens to those cells, you can't reverse it effectively. In terms of supplements, probably the main one that we understand from Chinese herbal medicine is Astragalus. So Astragalus is a Chinese herb that we understand to effectively help remove creatinine from the blood.
Okay.
So it helps to, again, lower stress on the kidneys. But again, the mechanism of how it actually lowers creatinine in the blood is poorly understood. All we know is that when we utilize somewhere in the region of 8 grams of whole plant Astragalus, we see a significant decrease in creatinine.
Okay.
And that's sort of why I created that Astrag Flow or kidney stack with supplement needs.
Okay.
Then the liver function, your ALT is slightly elevated at 51. So ALT is alanine transferase. That is telling me that you did train, within a couple of days before.
Yeah, it was the day before.
So ALT is localized also within muscle tissue as well as the liver. So it's not as specific as AST. So AST would be aspartate transferase. AST would be more localized within the liver as opposed to muscle tissue.
Okay.
So it allows you to assess how much, liver tissue has become damaged. And obviously then we can correlate that back to, is there a level of liver function being lost? But your liver function there is all good. Your ALP,
what just to backtrack, so the primarily function of the liver, just in case people didn't know, what is the main focus of the liver? So
the liver is probably the main organ site for excretion and metabolism. So when you ingest food, when you ingest supplements, medication, your liver will do a metabolic transformation to the chemicals that are in your food, in your supplements, medications, whatever. That can either be a positive outcome in that it activates those molecules so that they pass back into the blood to have an effect, or it has a detrimental effect in that it deactivates the molecule. So for example, oral anabolic steroids, when you ingest those, your body will try and do a transformation in order to break down that oral anabolic steroid for excretion. So either in your urine or in your feces.
Okay.
Now, when it does that biochemical transformation within the liver, we have what's known as different pass effects within the liver. So you have a first pass effect, which means that when you ingest something, as soon as it hits your liver, that's it, it's gone. And then you have what's known as a second pass effect, whereby when you ingest something, it goes to the liver tries to break it down, but it can't, and it passes back into your body again.
Okay.
So that's what happens with oral anabolic steroids, is that we've put this 17 alpha metal group onto the steroid structure to make it resistant to the liver breaking it down. And that's why it then passes back into the system again. So
Okay.
the liver does these biotransformations in order to make them more readily excreted from the body.
Okay.
It also then creates your lipids, so your LDL and HDL. So it's very important for glucose and fatty acid metabolism also. The liver function there is all good. Your ALP, which is alanine phosphatase, is a transport protein that's on the surface of your cells that transports phosphate molecules in and out. Yours is at 73, so that's all good. Ideally, we don't want this to be potentially lower than 65 or 70.
Okay.
ALP relies on adequate amounts of zinc and magnesium in your body. So if you don't have high amounts of ALP in your blood, it could be potentially because you have zinc and magnesium deficiency.
Okay.
Your bloods aren't showing that, which is great. Your GGT, which is gamma glutamyl transferase, is a enzyme which recycles glutathione in your body. So glutathione is a 3 amino acid peptide your body makes from glycine, glutamic acid, and cysteine. So effectively, GGT recycles these 3 amino acids back into glutathione. And glutathione is one of the key antioxidants that your liver makes in order to help protect itself against toxic substances and to make them more readily excreted in your urine also.
Okay.
It's also very important because it's one of the key antioxidants your immune system makes to protect your body's own cells from being damaged when it's trying to kill viruses and bacteria. So ideally, we want GGT to be less than what it is currently for you. The real sort of optimal range would be between 16 and 20.
Okay. So you'd recommend me supplementing with some glutathione to help knock that up?
Ideally, yeah, we want the more glutathione you ingest, the less GGT has to work, and the value will then drop, if that makes sense. So the higher the higher the GGT, the more GGT that's present in your blood, which means it's having to work harder to give your body glutathione.
Okay.
So when it's a lower value, it means there's less GGT present, meaning that it's not having to work as hard. If you look at some papers, it's directly correlated to iron, like what we said about iron being an oxidant.
Yeah.
GGT or glutathione is one of the key antioxidants that helps mop up iron in the blood.
Okay.
So if you have elevated iron and you have high GGT, it's a scenario where your arteries are being degenerated, which can then offset into cardiovascular disease. Okay. So that's why we want to ensure we have adequate amounts of glutathione. So it's cleaning up all these nasty pathogens and oxidants in our blood.
So if GGT was low, but I wasn't supplementing with glutathione, would that just mean there's an issue with that function of the liver?
So if GGT is very low, it could be an indication that you've a low instance of magnesium and zinc. Okay. So again, GGT relies on magnesium and zinc to work correctly also. So low GGT can be a sign that you're not able to make enough. It doesn't necessarily mean that your body's being super and not making, any GGT to deal with the demand. It could be that your body can't make enough GGT.
Yeah. Okay.
Because of that magnesium deficiency. And then your bilirubin, which is a marker of the breakdown of your red blood cells, that effectively creates your bile. We'd be looking at values here to understand, was there any sort of bile blockage or cholestasis where the cholesterol can't flow correctly out of your liver into your small intestine. Yeah. And yours is normal at 4.5. So, I mean, this sort of first page, looking at it, I'd be able to, without even getting any history from you, could say, you're not using any oral AAS or haven't used any oral AAS in the last, 7 or 8 weeks.
Yeah, for a long time, to be honest with you.
And that would be sort of what we see detrimentally affect blood work quite drastically because of how they interact at the androgen receptors in our cells, as well as having extracellular effects also. So they're sort of the main ones that we really have to have a risk strategy in place when we're using them. Injectables tend to have I guess a lesser toxic profile to them, but still need to be, I guess, effectively managed correctly. And that's why we do the blood work.
And then page 2.
And then the last sort of page, we have your lipid panel. So in the lipid panel, we have the total cholesterol, your HDL, which is high density lipoprotein, your triglycerides, your LDL, which is low density lipoprotein, and then various different ratios. So your total cholesterol to HDL ratio and your HDL to cholesterol ratio itself.
Yeah.
And then we have what's known as non-HDL cholesterol, which is effectively all the different types of cholesterol within your blood that is not high density lipoprotein.
Okay.
So you can sort of see your non-HDL cholesterol is very similar to your LDL because your LDL isn't HDL. So effectively your non-HDL will encompass LDL, ILDL, which is intermediate LDL, and VLDL, which is very low density lipoprotein.
Okay.
So the non-HDL cholesterol would be the main one we're looking at towards, what are there any arterogenic lipoproteins present? Because VLDL is very arterogenic. We'd sort of look at your total cholesterol value here and see how high the cholesterol is in your blood. Now, effectively, you have to view cholesterol as a transport molecule.
Yeah.
It transports lipids and it transports fats in your blood. That's its primary purpose. It's not made in order to create heart disease in your body. They have different functions. So your HDL transports lipids and fats from your cells to the liver for recycling, and your LDL transports lipids and fats from the liver to your cells to be uptaken. So the outside of your cells are made with a phospholipid membrane, and effectively LDL delivers those lipids to contribute to creating those phospholipid membranes. So LDL is a very important molecule in our body because without it, we wouldn't be able to transport lipids and triglycerides.
Because a lot of people think that, HDL is healthy, so that's supposed to be really high, then LDL is the bad cholesterol, that's supposed to be really low, but that's not true.
Not really, to be honest. What really matters is the function of the two molecules. So HDL, there are subtypes of HDL that can be pro-arterogenic. So just because you have high HDL doesn't mean you're cardioprotected. It could mean that you actually have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease because you're not making the correct type of HDL. So the size and the function of the HDL and what's on the surface. So on the surface of your HDL, you have what are known as apolipoproteins. These apos are very important because they're the sort of receptor docking for what those cells do.
Yeah.
So it makes a big difference then also between what the subtypes of the LDL molecules you're making also. So when we do your blood here and we see your LDLs at 3.15, it's telling us that your LDL is elevated in your blood serum compared to the reference range, but it's not giving us a breakdown of what that type of LDL is being made.
Okay.
So that could mean that, you're making effectively large LDL particles, which effectively can't as easily pass between the endothelial cells of your arteries. Or you could be making very small, dense LDL particles where they're small and carry a high lipid load for their size relatively. Those small lipid particles can effectively pass between the gaps of the single cells of your epithelial cells of your artery and trigger off an inflammation cascade and an immune response that leads to the development of plaque.
Okay.
So we sort of touched on this in the seminar that it's important that we keep our LDL oxidation down when we're viewing lipids as opposed to keeping the actual number of LDL molecules down. Obviously, there is a correlation, a cause and effect that, the higher LDL goes, the higher risk you are for cardiovascular disease. but it's because the more LDL particles that are present, the greater the risk for those LDL particles to become oxidized becomes. Not just that because you have a higher amount of LDL, it's directly causing plaque.
So what if that LDL, at what rate would people need to really be worried about?
So all the time, to be honest, and that's why, blood work when it comes to the lipid panel, effectively, I guess how we have to view it is one of the key medicines that is used for lipid management is a statin. And a statin effectively blocks what's effectively the enzyme HMG co-reductase. That effectively creates cholesterol or lipids from a cholesterol backbone.
Okay.
So when it's operating at a higher rate, you're making more LDL particles, and when you take a statin, you block that conversion process, so you don't make a lot of LDL particles.
Okay.
Now, just because you don't make a lot of LDL particles now doesn't mean that your cardiovascular disease risk has diminished. You can have low LDL and still suffer a heart attack if that low number of LDL is still getting oxidized at the same rate.
Okay.
So this is a big paradigm shift within cardiovascular disease knowledge that, yes, we need to manage LDL, but we more so need to manage the oxidation of those particles. Similar to like what we discussed about the iron, the LDL particles can get oxidized themselves, so they become unstable. And as an artifact of that, the white blood cells in your body try and stabilize that LDL again by basically eating it and removing it from the blood circulation.
Okay.
So you have like the macrophages are a type of white blood cell you have that are like little Pac-Men. They come along and eat up this LDL particle that's become unstable to try and stabilize it. But in the process, the macrophage turns into a foam cell. So it actually incorporates this, sticky residue of LDL inside its belly and effectively starts clumping to other foam cells to generate plaque.
Yeah.
So over time, the more LDL oxidation that occurs, the higher the rate of plaque formation inside your arteries. And then eventually, at some point, what we call the arteroma, which is effectively the deposition of all that plaque and foam cells, can bulge into the artery, creating a higher pressure.
Yeah.
And effectively that artery can't withstand that pressure any longer when there's enough of a bulging through and it just bursts into your blood system. Your platelets come along, see this big clump of foam cells and plaque floating in the blood, and sees that, again, it's an unstable residue. The platelets clump around it to try and remove it from your blood, effectively forming a massive clot, and that's what goes to your heart or brain. So it's important then, in terms of management strategies, bodybuilders stay on top of keeping their LDL oxidation low. So high ingestion of balanced antioxidants and polyphenols within their diet, limiting, their ingestion of, processed foods and hydrogenated oils, which can effectively cause lipid peroxidation, which effectively is this destabilizing of your LDL particles. And like what I said at the seminar, the simplest way to do this is stick into single food ingredients. As boring as like chicken, rice, veggies, it's quite, a no-brainer that when you start, binging on, again, fried foods, bodybuilders, I'm not saying bodybuilders don't enjoy themselves, but you need to really have a clear strategy in place here that even in an off season, that the majority of your food comes from single whole food ingredients. The off season it tends to be where a lot of health damage is done to bodybuilders, because when you effectively look at your pre-contest diet, there's very little flexibility there to be eating, pizzas, burgers, etc. That you really are relying on single foods like, your lean protein, your complex carbohydrates, etc. That the risk of ingesting stuff that's going to cause lipid peroxidation is a little bit lower than the off season. So
yeah. And you can just get your cholesterol checks done. It doesn't necessarily need to be a full blood panel, does it? So if you want to check it more frequently, especially in your off season when obviously diet's not as clean, you can just get your cholesterol checks done.
Yeah, and you will see an elevation in cholesterol if you're ingesting a higher amount of fat. Again, it's just a consequence because your body makes these lipids to transport fats. So if your diet is a higher percentage of fat, you're going to see your LDL rise with it.
Yeah.
What we're sort of looking at here is your triglycerides, which is a marker of how much actual fat is in your blood that's free and not being transported on an LDL particle. And yours is at 1.26. So again, your lipid metabolism within your blood at the moment is normal. If we've seen, metabolic dysfunction or issues towards potential cardiovascular disease, we'd see triglycerides begin to elevate at an unmanageable rate.
Yeah.
So if you do ingest a very high carbohydrate diet, you might see a small elevation in triglycerides in your blood work. This can be an artifact of when you have a high amount of carbohydrates in your diet, your body doesn't tend to make as much HDL. But what it does is produces what are known as remnant particles, which effectively are just these empty shells. And when we do a blood work analysis, the characterization of triglycerides can sometimes pick up these remnant particles. So if you had a high carbohydrate meal the night before your blood work and your triglycerides come back at like 2.4, it might be because of you had that high carbohydrate meal the night before and your body has just produced these remnants due to it. It doesn't necessarily mean that your cardiovascular disease risk is elevated. So it would mean that the next time you do your bloods, effectively fast from maybe 6 p.m. in the evening until 8 p.m. the next morning, avoiding a high carbohydrate meal before bed to remove that bias.
Yeah.
But given where everything here is with yours, there's nothing really, your HDL is just slightly below the range. And given that you are on cycle, your HDL is affected by androgens because testosterone, when it binds in your liver, will increase how much hepatic lipase you make. And hepatic lipase is the enzyme that breaks down HDL in your liver.
Okay.
So when you have higher amounts of androgens in your system, your hepatic lipase expression increases.
Yeah.
So we would expect to see that HDL take a drop.
Because that's good to know. Because I know, like, a lot of times, like, especially myself, we know that, okay, if we use this is high, but we don't really know why. We just know it is. So I think just the fact that you're going through, okay, if you use this, this is what's high and this is why. Yeah. And I think it's the why is where people's knowledge lacks.
That's exactly it. And that's why, again, to go back to the why, when you use oral anabolic steroids, their interaction with your liver is far greater, again, because of that metabolism, that second pass metabolism, that they interact with the androgen receptors of your liver several times, that they have a higher probability of interacting and lowering your HDL because of the increased amount of hepatic lipase you're making. So that's why, when you look at someone's blood work, the likes of Anavar or Trenbolone, we can tell, if someone's using these compounds because of the significant suppression of HDL due to how those molecules interact in the liver. Yeah. So everything here with the lipid panel, everything is absolutely fine, to be honest. LDL slightly increased. So, I try and tell people, regardless of your status, whether you're natural or enhanced, the CV stack, the heart stack that I've developed, is probably one of the key supplements that you take year round, because of it has a trademarked form of vitamin E, which has all 8 forms of vitamin E that you need. So the tocopherols and the tocotrienols. It has effectively, a complex of green tea extract, grapeseed extract, allicin from garlic, all these really known high polyphenol compounds that is going to protect your LDL molecules from being oxidized. So it's an absolute no-brainer when we're trying to mitigate that risk strategy of ensuring LDL oxidation stays low.
Okay.
Then sort of to close it out, then the hormones and thyroid panel. So these are sort of like your hormone panel of the body. FSH and LH are the two fertility hormones that you make in your pituitary of a male. So follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Again, this is if you were trying to be clever and you were trying to, I guess, not lie, but try and get around a medical profession that you weren't using steroids. As soon as you look at someone's blood work for FSH and LH, you can tell whether they're using steroids or not, without even looking at the testosterone value. And that's primarily because when you take anabolic steroids, without getting into a deep conversation on it, your pituitary and hypothalamus function gets shut down, so you don't produce your own FSH and LH. So that's obviously to be expected.
In theory, that's why your testicles shrink.
In theory, yeah, because of the LH value dropping. So that stimulation on the Leydig cells, which make testosterone, drops. So you'll see that drop in testicular size.
Yeah.
Your estradiol is absolutely fine. So estradiol is created from testosterone and it's aromatization. That's absolutely fine at 58. Again, it's more so the ratio between your estradiol and testosterone that becomes important. Effectively, in a normal male, estradiol to testosterone is about a 1:200 ratio.
Okay.
So effectively, where yours is sort of sitting, there's a much higher percentage of testosterone versus estradiol. So the likelihood of any sort of estrogenic side effects presenting in your body is quite minimal. Your SHBG is at 18, so that dictates basically your sex hormone binding globulin of how much testosterone your body has capable of being free. So effectively, SHBG acts like a bus system that transports sex hormones through the body.
Okay.
It's produced by your liver. One of the ways that we lower SHBG production in the liver is actually by increasing testosterone. So if we look at yours, your testosterone sitting at 120 nanomolar, which is effectively 4 times the upper physiological range. And in consequence, your SHBG production in the liver has significantly decreased, causing you to have then a free androgen index, which is effectively the amount of free androgens within your blood system in relation to your sex hormone binding globulin and the albumin, because albumin that we talked about in the first page can also transport sex hormones. It gives you a ratio then of effectively how much testosterone is free and unbound compared to the amount of SHBG and albumin in your body. Okay. And your FAI is at 666.7. So massive increase in the ratio that's free and capable to interact with the receptors inside your cells. Okay. So obviously that's why we increase our testosterone level. Isn't necessarily to increase the total number of testosterone molecules in our blood. It's to increase the total number that's free, because the total number that's free is effectively what interacts at your receptor sites. Okay.
So in regards to my testosterone, obviously being at 120, I know when it comes to obviously people trying to dose and understand the amount of testosterone that they need to do. Yeah. At what point does more become not as efficient, and obviously with increased side effects along with that?
So effectively, you'd have to mirror it to your estradiol value and your 5-alpha reductase activity, which creates DHT. Yeah. So when you have higher amounts of testosterone in your blood, there's a higher probability it's going to interact with an aromatase enzyme, which would create estradiol. Yeah. And there's a higher likelihood that it's going to interact with a 5-alpha reductase enzyme inside your cells to create DHT. Yeah. And DHT being the more androgenic form of testosterone, which has a greater affinity for the androgen receptor. Okay. So you'd have to assess estrogenic side effects presenting themselves and DHT side effects presenting themselves. At 120 nanomolar, for that level, we know that somewhere in around 250 milligrams will yield a level of 45 nanomolar. So effectively, based on the bloods that are here, I'd be sort of expecting, a dose that's being taken for a normal metabolizing individual somewhere around 600 to 700 milligrams.
Yeah, bang on, 'cause mine's 600.
So that's effectively, you know, where we'd sort of correlate how these increases in dosages come from.
Yeah.
And you know, it comes back to this whole, a certain, you know, class of coaches are now going down the sort of milligram per kilogram route, which isn't the right way to view it, because effectively what you're doing here is you're utilizing a dose to yield a plasma level. And that plasma level, then we correlate that testosterone level back to your natural level.
Yeah.
So effectively, you know, if your testosterone was naturally, say, even 20 nanomolar before you touched any sort of anabolic steroids, you're sitting 6 times that natural level.
Yeah.
Now, there is going to come a point where, you know, are you going to keep increasing that dose to increase that plasma level? So, you know, if you get to, say, I don't know, 1,000 milligrams, your level's sitting at 180 nanomolar.
Yeah.
Beyond that, is there any point in continuously driving that test level up? So all of a sudden you've gone from, you know, a 1:6 ratio compared to your natural level to a 1:9. Do you keep going 1:10 and keep titrating this dose? You know, as you acquire more muscle tissue, the more androgen receptors that become prevalent, and the higher, you know, amounts of muscle protein synthesis you're then capable of handling, higher rates of, I guess, training intensity, because you've more DHT to stimulate that nervous system to handle heavier loads, which effectively makes you stronger, and then that translates over into bigger muscle tissue. You come to a point where, does it make more sense to potentially reduce the testosterone and then start to utilize a specific anabolic steroid, which has a greater affinity for accruing muscle tissue, so it's more selective towards muscle mass androgen receptors, as opposed to being more global and affecting both androgenic receptors within androgenic tissue as well as muscle tissue.
Okay, because in regards to obviously estradiol, so at what level does that need to be? Because I don't take anti-estrogens, just because I've always felt like I've not needed to, because I never, you know, I never really feel like I've got high levels of prolactin, or my estradiol's always been fine in the past. So at what level do you think people need to start taking it, or is it just based on the side effects?
Basically based on the side effects. Estradiol is a very important modulator of metabolism in the body. It's important for muscle protein synthesis. It's important for your insulin sensitivity. So we want to allow estradiol, the rate of aromatization, to increase with your testosterone to an amount where it's not going to yield a side effect in the body, whether that's physical side effect like gynecomastia formation, or mineral retention, whereby we have now an obvious increase in how your body is retaining sodium and potassium, which drives your blood volume up, which effectively increases your blood pressure, and that can damage your kidneys, etc. So we want to allow estradiol to increase to a rate where none of these physical symptoms appear. Given that your estradiol is sitting at 58, which is on the lower normal range, your genetics is more so probably not promoting the expression of aromatase in your body globally. So when you use testosterone, you're effectively retaining it as testosterone. What would be interesting to, I guess, have a look at and potentially measure would be your dihydrotestosterone level. So just because your estradiol value is low, are you then converting some of that testosterone over to DHT and the expression of DHT? Because again, DHT would have potentially its own side effects as well as its own positive effects. So, you know, an elevation in DHT might then, you know, cause potentially the development or proliferation of acne, so your increased sebum production on your skin, you know, male androgenetic alopecia, so it could offset inflammation in the scalp, causing you to lose hair, or it could stimulate the growth of hair because it stimulates stem cell production within your hair follicles. So that might be something to look at, because currently on your blood work, your prostate, your PSA is at 1.12, which is normal. but it is, it's not elevated, but there is presence of PSA. And like similar to CRP, we want PSA to be low, indicating that there's no production of it in the body.
Okay.
And PSA, prostate specific antigen, is made in response to potentially the secretion of it from our prostate cells as they are growing. And that's under the stimulation of DHT and estrogen. But because your estradiol value is in theory normal low on your blood work, it's potentially DHT that's driving that PSA secretion.
So for example, if estradiol's high and somebody wants to introduce an anti-estrogen, let's just say, Norvadex, tamoxifen, is there kind of a ratio to like dosage versus decrease, or is it solely individual dependent, because obviously it depends on how their body responds to it?
It would be completely individual based. So like you sort of touched there, tamoxifen or Norvadex being a selective estrogen receptor modulator, a SERM, that binds to the estrogenic receptor site, causing what's known as antagonism. So it docks to the receptor, but it doesn't activate it. So it effectively blocks estradiol in your body docking and causing the proliferation of estrogenic tissue. So that'd be sort of like your first line defense of blocking the receptor to ensure that it's not going to cause a side effect, but still allowing high amounts of estradiol to circulate through the body, because again, very powerful modulator of metabolism and for your HDL in your liver. So you're ensuring that you're stopping gyno from forming, but you're still allowing your body to have a high level of estradiol for its other positive benefits.
Yeah.
In the scenario where, say, it was highly elevated, way outside the reference range, you might start to see detriment then towards sexual function. So again, it can cause sexual dampening. So you might lose your libido because the ratio between your testosterone and estradiol has gone too high.
Yeah.
In that instance, then you might need to use a small amount of an aromatase inhibitor to just lower the amount of aromatization to an acceptable range, or you lower the dose of that testosterone that's aromatizing and replace it with potentially another anabolic steroid that doesn't aromatize.
Okay. Good.
Your cortisol and prolactin are all normal. So again, if your estradiol was elevated, it might drive your prolactin. That's all fine. Your cortisol is absolutely normal for that time of the evening. So it's showing good circadian pattern. This is a very interesting, blood work analysis, because effectively it's showing that, your body's getting ready for sleep at that hour of the night. It was like 20 to 9 when you had it done.
I'm normally in bed at 20 to 9.
So 70.4 is very low cortisol. So meaning that your body's sort of, you being out at that time of the night is telling me that, you're starting to cause maybe a little bit of disruption to your circadian rhythm because your body's getting ready for sleep.
Yeah.
Normally what we'd see in a person would be what's called the cortisol awakening response. And that's why the morning time you'd see the cortisol to be higher, closer to 500, as you see in the reference range. So absolutely perfect circadian balance there. And then like the last thing, your thyroid function. So your TSH, your thyroid stimulating hormone, is at 3.43. Your free T4 levels, which is the inactive form of thyroid hormone, is at 19. And your free T3, which is the active form, is sitting at 6.04. In terms of the thyroid function, the TSH, ideally we'd like to see that no higher than, say, 2. When it's higher than 2, it's telling us that the thyroid is being stimulated from the pituitary to make more thyroid stimulating hormone, which effectively then increases the amount of T4 and T3 that you're producing. So that'd be something that you just want to keep an eye on as you get older, that this TSH stays constant. Yeah. And in tandem, the T4 and T3 stays constant, because currently your metabolic rate is probably quite high because you've got quite a lot of free T3 within your blood, which is available to dock into receptors.
Yeah. So naturally, I've always said that I've got a fast metabolism because I struggle to gain muscle, but I can get lean really quickly. So would that indicate because I have supplemented with T3 before, whether or not that's necessary based on these figures or not now, I'm not too sure.
Yeah, based on your blood work here, you probably wouldn't have needed to use T3, to be honest. Sort of the indication for T3 use would be when you get to a point in your prep where your own free T3 level is below that 3 range.
Yeah.
That's when you'd want to start implementing, 25 micrograms of T3 as a replacement dose in order to, I guess, anchor and stabilize your body's production of T3.
Yeah.
In this instance, you're nearly sitting right at the top of this reference range, meaning that you have quite a lot of T3 available, which could be an artifact of your testosterone, increasing the conversion of T4 to T3 also in your body. So
I've always been interested in knowing. So when it comes to obviously supplementing with T4 and T3, like from a basic point of view, T4 converts into T3, which is obviously what the body utilizes. So if you're supplementing with additional T3, is there any point in also supplementing with T4?
No.
I've always said that. Yeah. And there's so many people, and I always say to them, I was like, because I've got quite a few diabetic clients and things. So I've reviewed on that, and also links with clients as well that have got like thyroid issues that's been clinically diagnosed. And I've always kind of said that when bodybuilders kind of supplement with T4 and T3, it's never made any sense to me if you supplement in with T3.
I think what it stemmed with a couple of high profile coaches using T4 and T3 and putting it on forums, and people are like, oh, if we take the two of them, there's going to be a compounding effect. To be honest, if you use T4 alongside T3 and your free T3 level in your blood is adequate, you may be pushing yourself in the wrong direction towards thyroid cancer in the long run, or thyroid calcification and thyroid nodules. Because effectively, you think about it, you use T4 as a supplement, what happens to it? It gets stored in your body. If your body's making T4 of its own, it comes to a point where what we effectively call thyrotoxic. You have massive numbers of T4 being stored in the thyroid, not being converted to T3 because it's not required. So T4 gets converted to T3, even from a pharmacological perspective of treating someone who is hypothyroid, meaning they have low thyroid function. Using T4 still doesn't make sense because you're just giving the body the substrate to convert it to T3. And T3 conversion is reliant on so many different mechanisms, primarily what are known as selenoproteins. And the selenoproteins transport the thyroid hormones. And effectively, you have what are known as deiodinase enzymes, which remove an iodine molecule from T4. So effectively, T4 is 4 iodine molecules. T3 is triiodo 3 iodine molecules. So removing that iodine from T4 to T3 is the critical step in how you, I guess, free up your T4 to T3. But again, there's so many different things that are in control of that T3 conversion, such as your androgen or your estradiol level, your blood glucose metabolism. All these things play into how your body converts T4 to T3. So even if you are hypothyroid, I never understood this principle in endocrinology of prescribing a hypothyroid patient T4 in order to give their body T4, but expect it to convert it to T3. When it would make more sense to give them a small dose of T3 and maybe, supplement with some T4. So you're giving the body a nudge with some T3 and you're giving it some more substrate in order to encourage it to make its own T3, but not necessarily given a full-fledged, your body on average makes about 100 micrograms of T4 and 25 micrograms of T3. So from that 100 micrograms of T4, you convert 25 micrograms to T3. So effectively, if you give someone 100 micrograms of T4, which is the standard prescribed dose, or even what bodybuilders take, if you take 100 micrograms T4 and 25 micrograms of T3, the T4 is going to do nothing because your body isn't going to convert it to T3, because your plasma level of T3 from using T3 by itself is going to be sufficient.
Yeah, I've always thought exactly the same. It was good that you kind of clarified that. Then one other question on thyroid. So if you are supplementing with T3, would that have any kind of negative effects on your body's natural body of T3?
Not
or
necessarily.
Not? Okay.
So unlike the HPTA axis, you do have a hypothalamic thyroid axis. So in that instance, the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis can suffer slightly having supplemented with T3. But in all my time of looking at blood work, and this again was sort of one of the very first bro science myths that I put on Instagram, geez, it must be like 4 years ago.
Yeah.
I have never ever seen TSH anywhere close to 0.
Okay.
So when you look at your FSH and LH, you can see that it's at 0.3 and 0.3 or less than 0.3.
Yeah.
Effectively meaning that your pituitary is not making any FSH and LH.
Yeah.
I have never seen TSH, which is the thyroid version that stimulates the thyroid, to be close to 0. So you take T3, you have a thyroid rebound, your thyroid hormones get shut down. If you use T3 in a contest prep setting, and say you use massive, ridiculously high amounts of T3, like 75 micrograms. So effectively you're using triple your body's metabolic rate. If you titrate that down post-contest then to say 25 micrograms for 1 week and then to 0, you're going from a sky-high metabolic rate to a normal metabolic rate at 25 to titrating to 0 to allow your body to overcompensate and start producing its own T3 from the T4.
Yeah.
A lot of guys then blame getting fat post-contest on T3 use and this thyroid rebound, when to be honest, it's actually they just binged and tried to blame that it's a metabolic issue when it's actually what they put in their mouth.
You do hear it a lot where people are like you say, like use it, and a lot of people have kind of always said like to taper off it.
So it makes sense. It makes sense like to taper off. If you're taking like 75 or 100 micrograms of T3, you don't want to go from 100 micrograms of T3, which is effectively 4 times your metabolic rate, if we're going to view it that way, to nothing in the space of a week, because the adaptation of your, I guess, thyroid receptors of your body having been exposed to that high dose of thyroid hormone isn't going to bode well when you go to nothing. Yeah, you probably might have a couple of days where you actually might feel quite depressed because thyroid hormones, specifically T3, have positive mental stability effects in terms of how they affect neurotransmitters as well in the brain.
Yeah.
So, and effectively, when someone's suffering with depression, especially postnatal depression, a lot of it is driven by thyroid metabolism.
Yeah.
Postpartum. So when it comes to using sky-high amounts of T3, it would make sense to slowly titrate down. But I'm not talking about like 100 micrograms for like a few weeks and then dropping it to 50 and then to 25. You might go from 100, say, to 50, where you've halved your dose. So again, you're weaning the body away from that dose over a week, basically. So you go from 100 to 50 for 1 week, and then 50 to 25 for 1 week, and then off.
Yeah.
You could just go from 100 to 0, but you would expect a small backlash because of the body's so used to adapting to that sky-high exposure to T3 that the stepwise titration is not going to be as evident to that person in terms of its effect. So
perfect.
And then to close, your vitamin D level at 70 is absolutely adequate. In sort of like the current climate, we want to strive for somewhere around 80 to 100.
Yeah.
Where you're sitting at 70 is absolutely perfect. Your serum folate is a little on the low end, so there could be an issue here where you're not actively transporting folate correctly in your blood, or you're not getting enough due to potentially might have a genetic issue, or your diet just doesn't have enough folate in it.
Okay.
So it might be worthwhile looking at supplementing with tetrahydrofolate. So in the multivitamin that we have at Supplement Needs, I've put in specifically folate and not folic acid.
Okay.
When you take folic acid in a multivitamin, it has to get converted to folate in your body.
Yeah.
So that enzymatic conversion is quite slow. So it's more beneficial that you use folate directly as opposed to folic acid. So,
what do folates do?
So folate is involved in methylation So methylation is how your body turns on and off genes in the body.
Okay.
So your body uses these methyl donors. So a methyl group in chemistry is just a carbon with 3 hydrogens.
Okay.
And this carbon with 3 hydrogens attached docks onto specific points on your gene. So it's almost like a light switch. It docks in and it tells the gene, I'm present, turn on, or I'm not here, turn off.
Okay.
So that methylation process is what effectively controls how your genes are expressed in your body, whether they're on, off. Sometimes you might have over methylation where your genes are constantly stuck on, and then you can have under methylation where your genes aren't actually working correctly.
Because a lot of the times they recommend supplement it when you're trying for a baby, or for females when you're pregnant, don't they?
Yeah,
and
that's for that reason, for methylation, to ensure that when the fetus is developing, that the methylation processes in the fetus is occurring correctly. So effectively what we see then, if there isn't enough folate present, we might see neural tube defects within that fetus developing, where the neural tube, the genetic expression, never actually tells it to seal and close off. So the neural tube stays open.
Okay.
Folate's important because it effectively tells the body when to express the gene and when to not express the gene. So having adequate levels of folate is very important for that gene expression in a developing fetus.
Yeah.
So in this instance, it would be probably wise that, slightly bump up your folate intake, look at green leafy vegetables, or use a multivitamin or supplement that has methylfolate within it.
Yeah. Perfect.
So overall, compared to, what I've seen with other bodybuilders, this blood work is, very mild, we could put it, that there's nothing, there's no alarm bells or, anything really cause for concern, especially even from the beginning of the conversation and the time length of the exposure that you've used for. It's, it's one of these things that blood work is going to tell you what's happening right now in your blood.
Yeah.
But it's not going to tell you what's going to happen in 5 years' time.
Exactly.
And that's why I said, even at the seminar, doing advanced cardiac imaging like an echocardiogram or a cardiac MRI with contrast will show you what's actually happening within the body itself in a 3D setting. We can use blood work to make informed decisions of what's happening in our body now and put sort of risk strategies in place to offset it. But it doesn't necessarily tell us that right now at this moment you have 50% plaque in your coronary artery.
Yeah.
Just because your blood work looks good doesn't necessarily mean that there's no disease having occurred from being exposed for so many years. So that's why it's...
Oh, sorry, I think as well, another issue sometimes that can occur, especially with bodybuilders, we always want to push, is that when you kind of get that feedback that your blood work's okay, it's like, great, I'm going to do more. And that can be quite a negative effect of having good blood work, which is bizarre, rather than thinking, well, actually, what I'm doing is working, performance in the gym is going up, I'm increasing my muscle mass and my health is pretty good whilst doing it. So rather than thinking, let's push it more, it's like, well, and the reality is, I'm not a professional bodybuilder. I'm an okay amateur. So one thing I've always done, I've got kids, so I don't want to massively put my health at stake for technically something that is a hobby, although it's my life. I'm not, going to be professional. I know that. So it's making sure that I do it to the best of my ability, but also in the healthiest and safest way possible as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's again, originally what started out as sort of my own sort of longevity, especially now that I have my own 2 kids, it is a change in mindset of, ensuring that you're here for the long run. And, you have to really have, like you said there, a real honest conversation with yourself. And a lot of unfortunate amateurs aren't willing to be that honest with themselves, that they're chasing this sort of pro card goal of, I'm going to aim for this pro card because it's so accessible now. It's making it, a very appealing way of getting your pro card very easy, as opposed to being like the top 1 or 2% in each country becoming professional. There's that many pro cards available now to enter into IFBB that it's great because it makes it so much more accessible, but it's not so great because it's now potentially encouraging people to make some risky decisions that previously they might not have. You know, if someone wasn't a decent amateur, I get, you know, you can have this persistent approach of the more shows you enter, the greater your name gets exposed, and potentially, you know, the greater exposure might come with popularity and your physique becoming appreciated by judges. But it might also then, you know, someone who might not have never ever considered going down the route of being a professional or taking these risks is now sort of looking and going, well, you know what, this is quite accessible. You know, if I keep, you know, staying on cycle for the next 4 or 5 years, potentially I could become a professional by playing this game of numbers. So it's great that we're entering into this realm where I can deliver this sort of education and get people to understand it. But it's also the expectation that people start having with themselves, that I guess it's a very difficult, honest question to yourself is, do I have the correct genetics to be a professional?
Yeah.
Regardless of the work ethic, because to be honest, anyone can achieve anything they put their mind to. It's clearly evident to everyone who, you know, is successful in life. But when it comes to this sort of scenario, and that success is determinant on you effectively taking health away from your body, at what point does that risk become accessible or accessible and acceptable to you, to basically the longevity of your life? So,
and there was a study many moons ago where they kind of asked the top Olympic athletes, it was, you know, if you took this pill and it would guarantee you a gold medal, but I can't remember if it was 5 or 10 years later you're going to die, over 50% of them said they would take it.
Yeah, and that's the glory of it. And not to be, again, not to try and be negative, because you have to be so supportive of what everyone wants to do with their life and their goals. But when you do achieve, you know, IFBB pro status and you don't have the specific genetics, this was sort of the point of why the 1 or 2% in the past turned pro, because effectively that physique was worthy of going straight into the pro ranks, and potentially being in the Olympia setting within 1 or 2 years, if again they had the work ethic there, the sponsorship, everything to ensure their physique could progress. We have guys here chasing pro cards just for the title, for again the glory of social media, and never actually do anything with their pro status. So it's sort of like you're chasing after this title that will never serve you in life properly. And the risks.
I think a lot of people do it. It's like you say, it's for the Instagram clout, but also for a lot of people now that are coaches, it kind of gives them that kind of level above everybody else by saying they're an IFBB pro. So I think a lot of people do it for that reason, for coaching, you know, personal training benefits, rather than actually thinking, I'm going to be, you know, one of the best in the world, etc. So because there's a lot of amateurs in the UK now that are literally traveling to every country every weekend, you know, that they're on a pre-contest cycle for such a long period of time just to try and gather that pro card. And the reality is if you're having to compete 5 or 6 times for a pro card, it's going to be very difficult then stepping on the pro stage.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, it's a game of numbers. It's becoming a game of numbers as opposed to I guess the best physique being picked. And again, like I said, there's no negativity to it. It's just that you have to be very honest that when you're chasing something like this, is it currently, you know, I guess having a positive to your health in the interim, or is it removing health or taking away health from you in the future? So that ultimately is why, again, going back to the very start, why I've started speaking about all this, because I just don't want guys chasing after something where really it's we have no definitive guideline that, you know, you use steroids, you're going to die 10 years younger than someone.
Yeah.
We know you're a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. You're potentially a higher risk of renal damage on your kidneys, or potentially liver cirrhosis. But there's no, I guess, standardized number of, you know, if you're going to make this choice of chasing after being a pro or taking massive amounts of steroids, this takes X amount of time away from your life. Because to go back to like the Olympic athlete setting, they're understanding that, okay, if I win this gold medal, I achieve this glory, and in 5 years I die. That's them choosing that risk.
Yeah.
Whereas if you were to say to someone, okay, the amount of gear you're taking and you're chasing after this pro card. Let's say, for example, it takes you 4 years of being continuously on cycle to become good enough to win your pro card, and telling someone, okay, you're now 35, you've got a pro card, but by the time you're 50, you're going to suffer a massive heart attack. Would they think differently over the choices they made over those years? Yeah. And that's something I've never really brought up on any other podcast or talk I've ever done before, that stark reality of that risk you're choosing to make having a long-term consequence.
But a lot of it as well is that risk is going to change as you progress in your life, because when I was younger, like I took more than I took now, a lot more, but then, okay, now I've got a wife, now I've got 2 kids. Now that risk to reward ratio just simply isn't worth it for me. So it does change, because, maybe 10 years ago when I first started and I was lucky enough to win my first show, I was like, yes, I won my first show. I might be onto something here. And then, 18 shows later and not many wins later, now I'm a little bit more of a realist. And I was willing to do a lot more back then. And if you ask me that question, then the answer may have been different to what it is now, because of where I am in my life and having a family and children. And that is more of a priority now than having, pro card's never going to be in the question for me, but, a plastic trophy, priorities change.
Even viewing it in terms of when you're younger, you're probably more willing to make more risk, and there's probably more leeway to that risk towards your long-term health.
Yeah.
What becomes more, I guess, extreme is, extending that risk then into your 30s and potentially early 40s.
Yeah.
And never actually, sitting back and having that realization that, again, is this going to have a positive influence to my health, or is it going to have a negative? And more often than not, you're just heading down a negative path.
Exactly. So just before we cut off, do you just want to explain a little about the SN education? Obviously, if anyone wants to kind of follow up and continue with.
Yeah. So obviously to start, I'm the formulator for supplement needs, and sort of as a byproduct to that, we set up SN education. SN education is sort of my sort of brainchild, where I brought on board one of my close friends, Stephen Cassidy, in order to set up a team of educators that had expertise in the relevant field. So obviously my expertise is in pharmacology, health, steroids. Stephen's background is in nutrition and being a coach himself. I've got Aaron Casely and Danielle Casely. So Aaron Casely's mofo body mechanic, very experienced university lecturer covering all aspects of physio, rehab, recovery, training setup. Danielle, his wife, registered dietitian, huge experience in female blood work and female health. We have Simon Hook, who's another chiropractor, massage therapist, who has huge experience in treating top level bodybuilders like James Hollingshead, etc.
Yeah.
So he brings a background of his knowledge towards rehab and training also to complement Aaron. Of Louis Blackmore, who's very heavily interested in mindset and stoicism when we apply that to our coaching methods for clients. And Louis was one of my first sort of clients also when I was a coach.
Okay. Where
I sort of influenced Louis towards this sort of, let's understand the root cause of how we adopt coaching practices. And we've Donna Murphy, who's an IFBB pro, female IFBB pro, and she's sharing all her knowledge towards her experience as a female professional. And we've recently brought on board another female, Olivia Archowski, who's a female health coach from Australia.
Okay.
She's a competitive female herself, having, been exposed to the whole female industry in Australia. And she's now training more so into functional medicine and applying that to female health and coaching. So the whole thing about SNE was to have this resource where you got access to. There's now 8 educators.
Yeah.
The subscription fee is $7.99 a month. We have an exclusive forum where we're on it every single day. So anyone that wants to join and ask us questions, you will get a specific detailed answer catered to you.
Yeah.
And obviously then that spurs more, discussion. So we only launched in August. So we're sitting at about just over 110 members, which
Okay.
we're very happy with. And obviously each month, all 8 of us release 2 pieces to 3 pieces of video content itself. And I guess sort of the premium aspect to it is our blood work discussion that's in tier 3. So the site is based on different. Tier 1 is free. So if anyone wants to join and get access to about 70 free videos on, again, the sort of training, health, nutrition, they're all there for you to enjoy for free. Tier 2 is the $7.99 monthly subscription. And then tier 3 is a yearly subscription. So I think it's $159.99 for the year. So it works out about £13 a month.
Yeah.
But within that, we have a dedicated blood work forum and dedicated blood work lectures. So like what we've done here today, where we covered over the different aspects of the blood work, there's like a lecture on hematology, there's a lecture on lipids, there's a lecture on the liver, there's a lecture on the thyroid. So what we're trying to do there is give you the knowledge to sit down and understand in a basic terminology of each section of a blood work panel. So if you're a coach and your clients are getting blood work, you can understand, what does that hematology panel mean?
Yeah.
What does the liver panel mean? So rather than me doing all these consults or, podcasts like what we've done today, because what we've covered today is essentially a service that I offer to people where we can sit and discuss blood work in depth. It gives them a chance at a monthly subscription rate to access. Every month there'll be new lectures dropping into tier 3 surrounding blood work. So for example, there might be an advanced lipid lecture coming in the next month that's all about, LDL oxidation and how it offsets into cardiovascular disease. Having covered in the first talk all the basics of what's LDL, what's HDL. So we're building from a base level of what is each thing into, let's start talking about all these disease mechanisms and why maybe steroids, again, like the liver, why does the steroids affect our liver function?
Yeah.
We go into that hepatic lipase and all that sort of stuff. So every month, 60 new videos roughly, and then obviously the forum every day. So it's in its infancy, but it's the interaction in the forum recently has been very encouraging. And like I said, we've been very selective in who we've chosen within the team off to their, I guess, the experience and education they can offer. So, I mean, I think it was Aaron that said recently, between like the 8 of us, you're talking about at least 90 years of experience between reading books and actual practicing what we do in terms of man hours. So it's for what you're paying. I'm very proud of it. It's just, again, in its infancy. So as the site evolves, I want to start catering the education more so towards what people want to learn about.
Yeah.
And again, I want to go to a very basic level of teaching someone a concept and then building it up to a very advanced level.
Yeah.
So like what we had to chat about today, my content for this sort of month was about aromatase. So I built on a very basic level on what aromatase does. And then by the end of it, you'll actually understand the molecular mechanism of what aromatase does to testosterone.
Okay.
So I'm giving you that very, very basic knowledge, but I'm then taking you sort of to like a university level where I'm giving you all the published research within this talk. So we're really striving not to be one of these sort of education sites where I'm just talking to the camera for 5 minutes. Yeah. I'm sort of almost like lecturing you on each sort of aspect so that if you're a coach, you're getting direct access to this upscaled knowledge every month.
Awesome. Fantastic. And again, that's just a gap in the market that's been needed to be filled for so long. And, the panel that you guys have got, that's absolutely amazing. So, anyone listening absolutely needs to be straight onto that.
It gets a little overwhelming some days because the time and effort that goes into developing the content that we're doing currently. Like I have a spreadsheet with about 50 video ideas and I'm looking at it thinking, I need to do that video. I need to do that video. Yeah. And it's sort of trying to get people to understand that it is an ever evolving site. That I had a lot of people ask, is this on the site? Is this on the site? When we launched, I think we started with 65 videos from day one. Okay. And then each month there's between, like I said, 12 to 16 videos. Yeah. So to try and deliver that high level of content, I'm not willing to just bang out 5-minute videos of me talking to the camera. Yeah. I want to actually present the research to you so that if you want to learn this stuff and then you want to upskill your own clients, I'm directly giving you this knowledge at a high tiered level.
Yeah. Awesome. Sounds great. Right. Well, that has been absolutely fantastic. I'm not sure if you can hear like the rumbling over the microphone, but that's like my stomach. Like if I go half an hour over mealtime, my stomach's like, so there's this random noise in the background. Like it's my stomach, not like an angry dog eating my ankle. But no, thank you very much, Dr. Dean, for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you again, mate. And that has been absolutely awesome.
Thanks a million, Jamie.
Right. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, mate.
No worries. Bye.